Hey, it's Mr. Wistar here. In this lesson, we're going to talk about how to create some more advanced layouts. In particular, we're going to focus on the grid bag layout class because it allows us much more control over how we arrange the objects in our swing application. We're going to cover some basic principles of effective layouts. We're going to review our understanding of some of the earlier layout managers that we've covered, and then we'll get into the details of grid bag layout. So just a couple of basic principles as we begin this lesson for what makes a good layout. Probably the most important thing is consistency. If you can start repeating the same basic principles for how you lay out the components in your application, then the user will have expectations for how to use it and they won't have to relearn how to use each screen. So try to be as consistent as you can. Try to keep it simple. Clearly, the easier it is for the user to navigate through a screen, the less time they'll have to spend learning how to use it. And try to give your page some sort of a hierarchy. Make the titles, make the most important parts of your page larger and more prominent using formatting. And generally speaking, the top and the left sides of your screen tend to be the more important parts of your screen, at least in this country. Okay, when you start creating layouts that have lots of controls, and by the way, when we say control, we just mean a swing object that's part of your screen. Once you start having pages with lots of different controls in them, the best way to organize the parts of that screen is by using JPanels. And in fact, try to group each subsection of your screen into its own JPanel. That's a good idea for a couple reasons. One, it allows you to organize the code for that section and sort of group it together. And two, it allows you to control the layout for each section separately. If you want part of your screen to have a grid and another part to have a more free-form layout, you need a separate JPanel for each part because each JPanel can only have one layout policy at a time. Now, we've talked about layout managers in the past. Just to review, every JPanel has its own layout manager that sets the policy for how things get laid out, and you specify that layout manager by using the set layout method. We've talked about a couple of simple layout managers before. There's flow layout, which is the simplest. All it does is just slaps things into your panel in the order that you add them without really giving much attention to what they look like. There's border layout, which allows you some control over the rough positioning of the items in your panel, but not a whole lot of control over what size they are or how they're arranged. So it's not really ideal. There's grid layout, which can actually be a very useful layout manager in the particular situation where you have a orderly rectangular grid of objects. So if you find yourself in that situation, grid layout is probably the way to go. Generally speaking, you're going to need a little bit more flexibility though, and that's where grid bag layout comes in handy. So it's like grid layout in that it involves dividing your screen into a grid, but the difference is that you can have a much more flexible grid. You can specify the row and column for pretty much anywhere in your grid for each control, and you can also have a control span multiple columns and rows in your grid bag. Now, just to be clear, because we're going to have to go back and forth between these terminologies, remember that columns in your grid bag are specified by X and rows are specified by Y, because columns control width and rows control height. Now, the way that you specify all of those properties for each control in your grid bag is by using something called a grid bag constraints object. You have to create that, and then you have to specify its properties, and then you pass that along when you add the control to the panel. You only need one grid bag constraint. You can keep reusing it over and over again. Whatever the properties of that grid bag constraints object are at the time you add a new control to the grid bag will be the properties that that control takes on. In terms of what those properties are, and again, these are not all of them. If you really want to get into the nitty-gritty details of grid bag layout, there's an excellent tutorial on the web from the makers of Java about how to use grid bag layout. Or you can look at the API page for grid bag layout and grid bag constraints, and they will give you more details. But the ones that we're going to focus on, the most important ones, we've got grid X and grid Y. Remember, grid X would be the column and grid Y would be the row. Similarly, we have grid width and grid height. Grid width is going to tell you how many columns an object takes up. Grid height is going to tell you how many rows a control takes up. Now, weight X and weight Y are related, but they're not quite the same. So, best way to think about it is this. Imagine that all the rows, or all the columns in your grid bag take up 100% of the width, and all the rows take up 100% of the height. But you might not want them all to take up the same amount of space. So, if you specify the weight X for a control, what you do is you give it a certain proportion of the total width for that column, and that's some number out of 1.0. So do a little planning, do the math, figure out what percentage you need, and then specify weight X. Weight Y is the same, but it allows you to specify what percentage of the total height for a panel you would like that control to take up. And the last is fill. Fill tells the control what to do with all the space that it's been allotted to it by weight X and weight Y. The default behavior is not to do anything with that space. The control will just take up the minimum amount of space that it needs, and then the rest of it will be empty. So if you want it to expand to fill that space in one direction or another, you need to specify the fill property for your grid bag constraint. Okay, let's take a look at some of those things. So here's a simple app. You can see that it's got some buttons. It's got a panel for some stuff going on. It's got a title we're going to throw across the top. And we're going to put those things in a simple J-frame. Now, because we have multiple objects, though, I have to put a J-panel inside the J-frame because each J-frame can only hold one thing at a time. So we're going to solve that by creating a J-panel, and then we're going to add those things to the J-panel. So I've got sort of 4 different flavors of layout just so you can see the complexity and the control that you have. The simplest one here is do basic layout. We're just going to call add. Remember, if you don't specify a layout manager, you get flow layout, and flow layout looks something like this. So when we run our program, wow, that's fantastic. So you can see that everything's there. Unfortunately, it's not really in any sort of good layout because flow layout just throws things in order. Okay, why don't instead we try at least to have some semblance of layout? We'll use a border layout. So here's a border layout. Remember, we have to use set layout in order to set it. And then each time you add something to a border layout, you specify its border layout position. And also notice once we've started getting into this level of complexity, we need a subpanel for our buttons because if we try to add them all to the west side of our screen, then only the last one will actually get that space. So we're going to put all our buttons in a panel, and we're going to add that panel to the west side. And then we're going to put the J panel where the stuff is going on in the center. So if we run that program, here we go. Okay, so this is already better. I mean, at least we have things roughly positioned where we want them to go. But I'm not really happy with the size of each component. As I said before, border layout's not really good at allowing you to specify exact sizes of the parts that it has. So we'd like to make the title a little bit bigger, I think. I think we'd like to make the buttons a little bit bigger just to balance out the size of our screen a little bit. So I think it's time to bust out the big tool. Let's use grid bag layout. Let's see how that works. So I have 2 grid bag layout methods here. We'll take a look at both of them. The first one has sort of a naive implementation of grid bag layout. Notice that we set our grid bag layout and then we had to create a grid bag constraints object. And then we're going to just keep reusing that grid bag layout constraints to specify the properties for each control. We're going to specify for our title that it's located in the top left-hand corner of our screen. We're going to specify that it takes up both columns. Now remember, we have our buttons in the left-hand column, we've got our game panel in the right-hand column. We want our title to span both columns. And also, we want to make sure that our title fills up the entire space that we've allotted it. So we specify those constraints, and then we just call add and pass the grid bag constraints object to the add method. Similarly, down here, we're going to do the same thing for the button panel, except it's going to be located in the second row, and it's only going to take up one column instead of two. And then the same thing is true for our game panel, except that it's going to be located in the second column. So let's go ahead and run that. And we will see some things that we like, some things that we probably don't. Okay, well, just to double check, we do have everything in the same, in the correct position in terms of where they are and what, how many rows and columns they cover. But obviously they're not really using the space properly. We need to specify grid width and grid height for each control so that they take up the appropriate amount of space. So let's go back to the drawing board. Let's try a slightly more complex version of grid bag layout. A lot of this stuff is the same, so I'll just highlight what's different. Notice that we've now specified a weight X and a weight Y for each control. And remember, weight X tells you what percentage of the column space you should take up. In this case, we want it to take up the title to take up 100%. Weight Y tells you the percentage of the row space you want that control to take up. In this case, we only want the title to take up 10%. Moving down here, we're going to tell the buttons that they can take up a third of all the column space and 90% of the row space. And then we're going to give the other 2/3 of the column space to the game panel. And again, we're going to give it 90% of the row space. So we've got that going on. Oh, since I didn't mention this line, but just to explain, we have to call validate after we've added all these things to our JFrame just to force it to repaint itself. Otherwise, we wouldn't see any of our hard work. So let's run that. Hopefully that looks more like what we're looking for. Let me go ahead and see that. Okay, so I think this is a little bit more like what we're looking for. You can sort of roughly eyeball the fact that the game panel is about 2/3 as wide as the buttons, and the title appears to be taking up about 10% of the height of the space now. Alright, so just to kind of quickly recap, we've talked about some basic ideas for what makes a good user interface. We've reviewed the idea of needing a layout manager in order to control how you organize the objects in your screen using JPanels for each subsection. And then we've gotten into grid bag layout, which allows you a tremendous amount of flexibility over how you specify the positions, the sizes, the relative sizes between rows and columns, and how the items in there fill up that space. All right, you're all set.